we began talking about what makes for peace, and that is the teaching in the Gospels, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, and so on. And to take them literally really meant that you began practicing the works of peace rather than the works of war.
Dorothy Day, a journalist and reformer, dedicated her life to fighting for peace and social justice. Her many books and newspapers show the commitment she had to all people, no matter the race, gender, or status. Her actions inspired many others to speak out for what they believe, including the ERA, which fought for women's rights. While commonly forgotten, Dorothy Day served a big role in the women's suffrage movement. In this project, I will discuss her influence on the modern social worker movement and the ways in which she can be considered the founder of it. The American journalist and Roman Catholic reformer, Dorothy Day, is often considered one of the greatest Catholic leaders of the 20th century. Once a fierce crusader, her motives are seen to broaden throughout her career as she begins to stand up for many diversified causes. Dorothy Day, a fillip for backlash against modern controversies, should be remembered as a pioneer in the early women's suffrage movement, nuclear testing, and the women's liberation movement. In order for Dorothy Day to spread her beliefs to other people, she needed to have good communication skills. She had to use tools such as the Catholic Worker, her newspaper, to stretch her ideas to a larger group of people. Even to do this, she had to make her writing easy to read and relatable, while also reflecting her goals for the newspaper. Dorothy Day made others understand how important their communication was. Her story can show people everywhere the importance of communication. Dorothy Day went to school in Illinois. While attending the Lincoln Park High School and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Day began to read literature by socialist authors and eventually joined the Socialist Party. When she was young, Day's father was an editor for the Inter-Ocean newspaper, which was based in Chicago. Some of her beliefs may have developed during her time spent in Illinois. At the time she attended school at Urbana-Champaign, she was still experimenting with her career. Dorothy Day's life experience, accomplishments, and journey started in Illinois. Most of the women she spent jail time with were part of a group called the Centennials of Liberty, or more commonly known as the Silent Centennials. In 1912, Woodrow Wilson began his campaign for office. Although Wilson believed that he was destined by God to become president, it was hard for him to win over the American citizens. But by 1917, he had gained a decent amount of support, so when women started holding banners outside his door, some men got angry. You see, many people at the time believed that the government, during a war, should be entirely focused on the war. They believed protesting in any way about issues within our own country was disrespectful to the people who were risking their lives to fight for it. But to radicals like Dorothy Day and Alice Paul, it only made sense to address these issues now, and in many ways they believed there might not be a better time. In their minds, if the government had not yet established the simple right to vote for women, how could they fight another country knowing that more than 1/3 the population wasn't being represented? On June 22, 1917, the police arrested two protesting women, Lucy Burns and Catherine Murray, under the charge of obstructing traffic. More women, 12 to be exact, were arrested under the same charges on June 25th and June 12th. Then, when given the option between a $10 fine and 3 days in jail, they chose jail because it signified that they care about women's suffrage and are willing to sacrifice their right to freedom. Dorothy Day, in addition to many other women, dedicated much of her life to the fight for women's suffrage. Dorothy Day showed her life's work for peace and social justice in the defense of everyone through her many books and acclaimed autobiography. She founded the Catholic Worker movement along with Peter Maurin. When Day met Maurin, he had already started a program that focused on social reconstruction. A year after they met, Day and Maurin created the Catholic Worker, this time a newspaper. And in only 3 years, the paper's circulation had grown to over 150,000. St. Joseph's House of Hospitality, one of the first shelters for the poor, was soon simulated in a couple of other cities. Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker movement inspired other people, which is really why she even began to write in the first place. She wanted everyone to become aware that there were people less fortunate than themselves, and that they needed to be supported. In 1952, Day's autobiography was published, titled The Long Loneliness. Dorothy describes her involvement in different socialist groups and her fight for all people. At the end of the book, she starts to reference the beginnings of her newspaper, The Catholic Worker. Day put effort into writing her autobiography in newspaper because she knew that she would be able to communicate her ideas to more people. Even if somebody doubted their impact on society, they were assured that someone was. Most people had the ability to read a newspaper and therefore became aware that these issues, especially when involving the poor, existed. If you had a lot of money, it might become easy to forget about the people who didn't. Dorothy Day was able to inform a great amount of people in a short amount of time, which is hard to accomplish. Dorothy Day, incarcerated nearly a dozen times, must have felt confident enough in her own beliefs to risk her freedom. We've talked about her connection to the women's suffrage movement, but while she was in jail, she participated in hunger strikes. Dorothy Day, along with most of the women arrested, were transferred to Virginia's Occoquan workhouse. On November 9th, Alice Paul, another women's suffragist, was also arrested and sentenced with a month's hard labor. She rebelled, going on hunger strikes and refusing to sew and wear prison clothes, a common activity incarcerated women were forced to do. This caused the other women to participate in these activities, including Dorothy Day. The women may have done these things as a threat on their part to the government. If one of these women starved to death because they refused to eat disgusting food, the government did not want to be responsible and receive bad press. After some time, a story, written by Alice Paul herself, was leaked and published in a newspaper. The story describes in much detail the force feedings that Alice Paul and most likely other women endured. She was fed through the nostrils twice a day with a tube. Her protesting often led to more initial pain. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. Dorothy Day risked her life by going on these hunger strikes just to prove that women should be granted the right to vote, and they would fight until they were able to. She went to jail many times and continued to fight for what she believed, knowing that she could be arrested. While preparations for nuclear testing started, so did Dorothy Day's protests against them. She opposed these tests and believed that peace is the only defense against nuclear war. The exercise the United States Federal Civil Defense Agency instituted was called Operation Alert, which started in 1954. This defense drill took place in many major cities on the same day, and some citizens were required to take shelter for 15 minutes while the civil defense officials practiced their preparations and communication skills. The federal officials were supposed to attempt an evacuation of the capital. Even the newspapers the next day published stories that were meant to simulate the aftermath of a bombing attack. During an Operation Alert in 1955, the citizens of New York failed to take cover, resulting in a $500 fine and a year in jail to those who did not make an attempt to do so. At the time this law was passed, Dorothy Day, along with a few other pacifists, staged a protest in Manhattan City Park as a form of retaliation. When the next drill started, they were ready to stay in the park. They soon explained to reporters that they were arguing the government's pretense that citizens should be protected in the event of a full-scale nuclear attack. Dorothy Day, along with the other 27 protesters, was arrested and given a suspension sentence. She participated in the protests every year, and soon a much larger-scale demonstration was held. This caught the attention of New York, and hundreds of protesters began to join in. The next Operation Alert in 1961 drew the attention of more than 2,500 protesters, taking place in other states as well. Dorothy Day, one of the original 27 protesters, inspired the entire country to understand that they have a voice, and together that voice can be heard. She knew that going to jail many times was worth the recognition the people of the United States gave her and her ideas. Dorothy Day, an activist for all people, should be remembered as a pioneer in the early women's suffrage movement, nuclear testing, and the women's liberation movement. She fought hard for women's suffrage, sacrificed many things for her beliefs, dedicated time into writing The Catholic Worker and her book, and was involved in many protests against nuclear testing, proving that she was committed to not only her beliefs, but everyone. In addition to being arrested nearly a dozen times, Dorothy Day risked her life during the hunger strikes that she participated in to draw attention to her ideas. She wanted the issues that she believed needed changing to be recognized and respected. Her life was dedicated to communicating to the world how she felt. The concepts that Dorothy Day argued inspired people to fight for what they believe and fight for the oppressed.